Hi friends! Today we're reading Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. We're on Chapter 2, Mr. Wonka's Factory. In the evenings, after he had finished his supper of watery cabbage soup, Charlie always went to the room where all of his 4 grandparents to listen to their stories, and then afterwards to say goodnight. Every one of these old people was over 90. They were all shriveled as prunes and as bony as skeletons, and throughout the day, until Charlie made his appearance, they lay huddled in their one bed, 2 on either end, with nightcaps on, and kept their heads warm, dozing the time away with nothing to do. But as soon as they heard the door opening and heard Charlie's voice saying, "Good evening, Grandpa Joe and Grandpa Josephine and Grandpa George and Grandpa Georgina," the 4 of them would sit up, and their old wrinkled faces would light up with smiles of pleasure, and the talking would begin. For they loved this little boy. He was the only bright thing in their lives, and his evening visits were something that they looked forward to all day long. Often Charlie's mother and father would come in as well, and stand by the door listening to the stories that the old people told, and thus for perhaps half an hour every night this room would become a happy place, and the whole world would forget that they were hungry and poor. One evening when Charlie went in to see his grandparents, he said to them, "Is it really true that Wonka's chocolate factory is the biggest in the world?" "True!" they all cried at once. "Of course it's true. Good heavens! Didn't you know that? It's about 50 times bigger than any other in the world." "And is Mr. Wonka really the cleverest chocolate maker in the world?" "My dear boy," said Grandpa Joe, raising himself a little higher on his pillow, "Mr. Wonka is the most amazing, the most fantastic, and the most extraordinary chocolate maker in the world." "I thought everybody knew that." "I knew he was clever, Grandpa Joe. I knew he was very clever." "Clever!" cried the old man. "He's more than that. He's a magician with chocolate." "You mean he can make anything he wants? Isn't that a fact, my dears?" The other 3 old people nodded their heads slowly up and down and said, "Absolutely true, just as true as can be." And Grandpa Joe said, You mean to say I've never told you about Mr. Wonka and his factory?" "Never," said Charlie. "Good heavens above. I don't know what's the matter with me. Will you tell me, Grandpa Joe, will you please?" "I certainly will. Sit down on my bed, dear, and listen carefully." Grandpa Joe was the oldest of the 4 grandparents. He was 96 and a half, and just about as old as anybody can be. Like all extremely old people, he was delicate and weak, and throughout the day he spoke very little, but in the evenings, when Charlie, his beloved grandson, was in the room, he seemed in some marvelous way to grow quite young again. All his tiredness fell away from him, and he sat as eager and as excited as a young boy. "Oh, what a man he is, that Mr. Wonka!" cried Grandpa Joe. "Do you know, for example, that he has himself invented more than 200 new kinds of candy bars, each with a different center, each far sweeter and creamier and more delicious than anything the other chocolate factories can make?" "Perfectly true," said Grandpa Josephine, "and he sends them all to the 4 corners of the earth. Isn't that true, Grandpa Joe?" "It is, my dear, it is. And to all the kings and the presidents of the world, too. But it isn't only candy bars that he makes. Oh, dear, no. He has some really fantastic inventions up his sleeve, Mr. Wonka has. Did you know that he invented a way of making chocolate ice cream so it stays cold for hours without even being in the icebox? You can even leave it lying in the sun all morning on a hot day and it won't go runny." "That's impossible," said Charlie, staring at his grandfather. "Well, of course it's impossible," said Grandpa Joe. "It's completely absurd." "But Mr. Wonka's done it." "Quite right," the others agreed, nodding their head. "Mr. Wonka has done it." And then again Grandpa Joe went on, speaking very slowly now so that Charlie wouldn't miss a word. "Mr. Willy Wonka can make marshmallows that taste like violets, and rich caramels that change color every 10 seconds as you suck them, and little feathery sweets that melt away deliciously the moment you put them between your lips. And he can make chewing gum that never loses its taste, and candy balloons that you can blow up to enormous sizes before you pop them with a pen and gobble them up. And by some secret method, he can make lovely bluebirds' eggs with black spots on them, and when you put them in your mouth, it gradually grows smaller and smaller until suddenly there is nothing left except a tiny little sugary baby bird sitting on the tip of your tongue." Grandpa Joe paused and ran the point of his tongue slowly over his lips. "It makes my mouth water just to think about it," he said. "Mine too," said little Charlie, "but please go on." While they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, Charlie's mother and father, had come quietly into the room, and now both were standing just inside the door listening. "Tell Charlie about that crazy Indian prince," said Grandma Josephine. "He'd like to hear about that." "You mean Prince Poticherry, said Grandpa Joe, and he began chuckling with laughter. Completely dotty, said Grandpa George. But very rich, said Grandpa Georgina. What did he do? asked Charlie eagerly. Listen, said Grandpa, and I'll tell you. That's chapter 2, friends. See you next time.